Every building begins the same way. You bring something in: stone, wood, brick, steel. Piece by piece, a structure slowly comes to life. That's how people have built for thousands of years. Which is why Kailasa Temple is so difficult to understand, because none of that happened here. No blocks of stone were brought to this site. No walls were assembled. No pillars were lifted into place. When the work began, there wasn't an empty piece of land waiting to become a temple. There was only a mountain. Everything you see today, the courtyards, the shrines, the towering columns, the carved elephants, was once part of that single mass of rock. The temple wasn't built on the mountain. It came out of the mountain. At first, that sounds like nothing more than an interesting detail. Then you stop and think about what it actually means. Every building allows for mistakes. A wall can be rebuilt. A damaged stone can be replaced. A design can change halfway through construction. Here, none of those choices existed. Once the rock was removed, it was gone forever. Every cut was permanent, which means the hardest part of this project wasn't carving stone. It was deciding which stone should never be touched. Long before anyone carved a doorway, or a staircase, or a single sculpture, someone already had to know where they would all be. Not approximately. Exactly. That's the part that still captures the attention of engineers, architects, and archaeologists today. Not because they question whether Kailasa is real. It stands there for anyone to see. What continues to puzzle them is the level of planning that such a project would have required. Even now, with modern surveying equipment, digital modeling, and machines capable of cutting stone with extraordinary precision, recreating Kailasa in the same way would still be an extraordinary challenge. So perhaps the mystery isn't whether ancient builders achieved something remarkable. The temple settled that question centuries ago. The real mystery is much simpler. How did they know where to make the very first cut? Because the answer to that question changes the way we understand everything that followed. The first cut was only the beginning. Before anyone could decide where to make it, they first had to understand what they were cutting into. At first glance, Kailasa looks like any other stone temple. There are gateways, columns, courtyards, shrines. Everything appears familiar until you notice something unusual. Nothing here stands on the mountain. Everything is still part of it. The floor beneath your feet, the walls beside you, the ceiling above you, all belong to the same piece of rock. The mountain was never taken apart. It was carefully reduced until the temple began to appear. That's a very different way to build. In most construction projects, the structure becomes larger every day. At Kailasa, the mountain became smaller. The temple revealed itself only because everything around it slowly disappeared. And that created a problem unlike any ordinary building. The builders weren't deciding what to add. They were deciding what could safely be removed. Those sound like the same decision. They aren't. One creates possibilities, the other eliminates them. Every piece of rock that disappeared removed another option forever. There was no second attempt, no replacement stone, no opportunity to step back and begin again. By the end of each day, the mountain had already been changed, permanently. That's why archaeologists often describe Kailasa as much more than an extraordinary temple. It's an extraordinary plan. Because long before the monument could emerge, someone had already worked out what the mountain would eventually become. Not one section, not one courtyard, the whole monument. That realization changes the investigation. The challenge wasn't simply carving stone. It was preserving an idea through thousands of irreversible decisions. And that's exactly where the next mystery begins. If the entire monument already existed in someone's mind, how did they transform that vision into the first cut without making the mistake that would have ended everything? If the builders already knew what the finished temple would become, one question immediately follows. Where did they begin? The obvious answer is the ground. That's where almost every great structure begins. You prepare a foundation, you build upward, layer by layer. It's such a familiar idea that few people ever question it. For years, many visitors looked at Kailasa the same way, until archaeologists started looking at the monument as a construction project, not as a temple. That changed everything. They weren't asking, "How beautiful is it?" They were asking, "How would you actually build this?" That's a very different question. And the more they studied the monument, the more a problem became impossible to ignore. If the lower levels had been carved first, how would workers have reached the upper sections? How would they have carved the roof without standing on the rock that had already been removed? Some parts of the project simply didn't make sense. Not with the temple growing upward. Then another possibility emerged, one that explained problems. The traditional idea couldn't. The work had most likely begun at the top of the mountain, not at the bottom. From there, the builders worked downward, gradually revealing the monument beneath them. It's one of those ideas that seems strange at first. Then, once you see it, it becomes difficult to imagine it any other way. But that discovery created a much bigger problem. If the roof came first, everything below it already had to exist in someone's plan, not after years of carving. Before the first cut, every pillar, every chamber, every staircase, every courtyard, their positions couldn't be guessed along the way. They had to be known from the very beginning. And that's the point where Kailasa stops looking like an extraordinary construction project and starts looking like an extraordinary planning project. Because carving the mountain may not have been the hardest part. Knowing exactly what the mountain would become before removing the first piece of it may have been harder still. So the investigation changes once again. The question is no longer where the work began. The question now is how anyone could plan something this complex without the luxury of making even one major mistake. Starting from the top solved one problem. It created another, a much bigger one. Once the first section of rock had been removed, there was no way to put it back. That may sound obvious, but think about what it meant for the people doing the work. Every day, they had to remove more of the mountain. At the same time, they had to protect the temple hidden inside it. Those two goals don't naturally go together. To reveal something, you first have to destroy what surrounds it. The challenge was knowing exactly where destruction had to stop. Too little, and the temple would never fully emerge. Too much, and part of it would disappear forever. There was no warning, no second attempt. The mountain didn't forgive mistakes. It simply kept the evidence. That's what makes Kailasa different from almost every other great monument. Most construction projects allow small corrections. Builders adjust. They replace damaged materials. They change the design when unexpected problems appear. Kailasa offered none of those choices. Every decision became permanent the moment it was made. The deeper you think about that, the more unusual the project becomes. This wasn't simply about carving stone. It was about making thousands of permanent decisions without losing confidence in the original plan. That's an extraordinary level of control. Not because every cut was difficult, because every cut depended on all the ones that came before it. One serious mistake, made early enough, could have affected everything that followed. Yet when archaeologists study the monument today, they don't see the signs of a project that slowly lost its way. They see consistency, the same proportions, the same architectural language, the same level of craftsmanship, from one part of the temple to another. That doesn't happen by accident. It suggests that the builders weren't making decisions as they went. They were following something, a plan, a method, a system. We don't know exactly what that system looked like. No complete construction guide has ever been found. But whatever they were following, it worked. And that leads to another question. If the plan was so precise, how large was the project they were trying to control? Because only then do we begin to understand the true scale of what disappeared. Once the first cuts had been made, the project entered a stage from which there was no return. Each day, a little more of the mountain disappeared. At first, the changes would have been almost impossible to notice. A narrow trench, a deeper channel, another section of rock, carefully removed. But years passed, then more years. Slowly, the shape of the mountain began to change. Not because something was being added, because something was constantly being taken away. Today, when visitors walk into Kailasa, it's easy to focus on the temple itself. What we rarely notice is everything that is no longer there. The open courtyard was once solid rock. The space surrounding the temple was once solid rock. Even the sunlight that now reaches the floor could only enter after an enormous amount of stone had been removed. Only then does the scale begin to sink in. Researchers estimate that creating Kailasa required the removal of roughly 200,000 tons of volcanic rock. The exact figure is still debated, but even conservative estimates point to one conclusion. This was one of the largest rock excavation projects of the ancient world, and unlike an ordinary quarry, the builders couldn't simply remove stone as quickly as possible. Every piece they removed had to protect the monument that remained. The temple wasn't hidden behind the mountain. The temple was inside it. Every day, the monument became more visible. At the same time, the margin for error became smaller. That's an unusual combination. Normally, progress makes a project easier to understand. Here, progress made every decision more critical, because the closer they came to the finished temple, the fewer opportunities remained to recover from a mistake. And perhaps that's why Kailasa still feels so extraordinary. Not because of the amount of rock that disappeared, but because the vision never seems to have disappeared with it. Which leads to another question. A project of this scale couldn't have depended on one person alone. So how did hundreds of craftsmen possibly work on the same mountain without losing that shared vision? For most of this journey, the mountain has been the main character. Its cliffs, its stone, its silence. But mountains don't make decisions. People do. Every surface carved into Kailasa began as an idea inside someone's mind. Someone had to decide where the temple would stand, how high it would rise, how much rock could be removed, and how much had to remain. Those decisions weren't made by the mountain. They were made by people. And that's where the story becomes much quieter. The farther we move away from the monument and into history, the fewer names we find. Today, most historians believe Kailasa Temple was commissioned during the reign of Krishna I of the Rashtrakuta dynasty. The historical evidence supporting that conclusion is strong. It gives us a place in time. It gives us a ruler. But it doesn't tell us who stood on the mountain on the first morning of the project. It doesn't tell us who looked across a wall of solid rock and somehow saw a temple waiting inside it. History remembers kings, That's understandable. Kings leave inscriptions, coins, records. Craftsmen rarely do. Yet the temple itself tells us their skill was extraordinary. Whoever led this project understood stone at an exceptional level. Not only how to shape it, how to leave it untouched. That may have been the more difficult decision. Strangely, the people who solved those problems are almost invisible in the historical record. Their work survived. Their names mostly did not. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of Kailasa. Millions of visitors know the monument. Almost no one knows the people who gave it its shape, and that silence leaves us with one final path to explore. If history no longer remembers the builders, perhaps it can still remember where they learned their craft. When we look at a monument like Kailasa, it's natural to search for one extraordinary person, one brilliant architect, one legendary master builder. History rarely works that way. Projects of this scale almost never begin with a single generation. They grow from knowledge that has been refined for centuries. By the time Kailasa was carved, the builders of India had already spent generations learning how stone behaves, how weight moves through rock, how pillars carry pressure, how sculptures can emerge without weakening the structure around them. None of that knowledge appeared overnight. It was earned. Slowly, patiently, one project at a time. Perhaps that's the easiest part of Kailasa to overlook. The temple feels unique. The people who created it probably did not. They belong to a tradition where experience moved from master to apprentice, not through long written manuals, but through years of observation, years of practice, years of mistakes made on much smaller projects. By the time a craftsman was trusted with Kailasa, he may already have spent much of his life working with stone. That changes the story once again. We're no longer looking at a miracle. We're looking at the highest expression of generations of accumulated skill. Maybe that's why Kailasa still stands apart. Not because it appeared from nowhere, but because it represents the point where centuries of knowledge came together in one extraordinary project. And then, something else happened. The monument survived. The tradition slowly changed. Kingdoms disappeared. Workshops closed. Master craftsmen passed away. New techniques replaced old ones. History kept the temple, but history doesn't always preserve the path that led to it. And perhaps that's why Kailasa still feels so difficult to explain today. Not because the mountain is hiding its secrets, but because time quietly erased many of the people who once knew them. Which leaves us with one final question. If the knowledge behind Kailasa belonged to an entire civilization, what does that say about the way we measure progress today? When this journey began, it felt like a story about a temple, a remarkable temple, one that challenged almost everything we thought we knew about ancient construction. But somewhere along the way, the story quietly changed. Without really noticing, we stopped talking about stone. We started talking about people, about planning, about patience, about knowledge. That may be the biggest surprise of all, because the more we tried to understand Kailasa, the less it seemed to be a mystery of engineering, and the more it became a story about civilization. We often think progress is measured by technology, better machines, better tools, faster construction. That's usually how we compare ourselves to the past. But Kailasa asks a different question. What if progress is also measured by how well a society preserves knowledge, by how carefully one generation teaches the next, by how many years people are willing to dedicate to something they may never live long enough to see completed? That kind of progress is harder to measure. There are no numbers for it, No machines can calculate it. Yet it may be the reason monuments like Kailasa were ever possible. Perhaps that's why this temple continues to challenge us. Not because we don't understand stone, but because we've been looking in the wrong place. The mystery was never hidden inside the mountain. It was hidden inside the people who stood in front of it, inside the traditions they inherited, inside the discipline they practiced, inside the knowledge they refused to let disappear. And maybe that's the question Kailasa has been asking for more than 12 centuries. Not, can you carve a mountain, but can you preserve wisdom long enough to make something like this possible?